So we have next on the list Dr. J. Alex Halderman. Dr. Halderman, welcome, and please introduce yourself for the record and give us your background, your professional credentials, all you want us to know for the public and for us, your expertise, and why we've asked you here to speak, and we're very glad to have you.
Well, thank you, Secretary, and I'd like to thank the Commission for the invitation to testify here today. My name is J. Alex Halderman. I'm a professor of computer science and engineering at the University of Michigan. Go Blue. I have a PhD.
Can y'all beat Bama?
We'll see. I hold a PhD in computer science from Princeton University, and my work is about cybersecurity. Some of the things that I do in security are much broader than election systems. Technology I've built helps to protect the majority of websites, and work that I've done is integrated into the web browsers and other client software used by billions of people. But for the past 15 years, one of the focuses of my research has been about the security of elections. During that time, I've twice testified to Congress about election security, vulnerabilities, and defenses. And I've done security analyses, hands-on, take computer systems apart and figure out how they're vulnerable types of studies for voting systems used in the majority of U.S. states and voting systems in a number of foreign countries. I'm also the co-chair of the state of Michigan's Election Security Advisory Commission for the Michigan Secretary of State. And I've done post-election forensic work for Michigan and pre-election machine testing for other states as well. So very, very glad to be here to assist the commission however I can.
Great. We appreciate it very much, and you can hop right into your presentation, and then I'm sure there'll be questions from the members.
Thank you. Could I have my slides up? I should add, I may be the only person, although it's impossible to say for sure, who's discovered security vulnerabilities in both kinds of voting machines currently used in Louisiana, although my style of work is to report those problems to the manufacturers and try to help get them fixed.
And that's why you're here.
I also want to note my testimony today is going to address threats faced by different styles of voting systems and their relative advantages, but I'm not offering opinions on any specific vendors or products. So in this testimony, one of the things that I hope to do is establish the state of what's scientifically known to be true about election security and try to separate that from certain misunderstandings or things that just are unknowns. But the scientific consensus, the consensus of the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, is that there simply is no realistic mechanism to fully secure vote casting and tabulation computer systems from cyber threats. So we can't build election technology. You can't go out and buy election technology that is invulnerable to the kinds of threats that credibly face election systems today. That's just a limitation of the current state of knowledge in computer security. But that means the challenge, the hard part of election systems, as I'm sure you know very well, Secretary, is to take fallible technology and use it to achieve a system that can provide security and public trust. So what I want to talk about today is some ways that we can do that using paper-based election systems. Try to create a system that can resist the threats that modern computers face and also that everyone can believe in. So just to get started, as you all may know, there are three main styles of voting machines that are found across the country today. And there are many models of each of these. But we have some systems that are not paper ballot based, like DRE voting systems. And these are now largely phased out across the country because of cybersecurity concerns. Then we have paper ballot-based systems, usually hand-marked optical scanners used in some combination with ballot marking devices. Hand-marked optical scanners, voter fills out a piece of paper, deposits it into a scanner right on top of the ballot box in front of them, or mails it in and it gets counted centrally. These are the most widely used voting system in the country. Many jurisdictions couple them for accessibility purposes with ballot marking devices, where the voter can fill out a ballot on a screen and it comes out of a printer and they can put it into a scanner just like the other ballots. A few states have opted to use ballot marking devices in a universal configuration where all voters in person are directed to use ballot marking devices rather than filling out paper by hand. But these three kinds of technologies are what you'll find just about everywhere across the country today. All three styles of technology, though, do face cybersecurity threats, as the National Academies recognized. And I want to talk a little bit from my personal experience about what these threats may look like. So, nearly 15 years ago, I was part of the first academic research team in the country to do a security analysis of a real voting machine used in U.S. elections. Prior to that time, the voting system vendors had made it very, very difficult for any third parties to get access to one, to do an independent security review. We brought it into the laboratory, reverse engineered it, figured out how it worked, and found some very serious problems. So to demonstrate what these problems might look like and what the security threat election systems need to be designed to defend against is, we would conduct a mock election on this machine between George Washington and Benedict Arnold. And I'll tell you what happened when we did. So what we discovered in this analysis was that these particular voting machines were vulnerable to infection by malicious software. And the way that an attacker could plausibly cause software manipulation was by infecting the digital memory cards that election officials use before every election to program in the ballot design, the names of the races and candidates and the rules for counting. If a memory card infected with the malware that we built was inserted into the machine itself would become infected. Thereafter, the malicious software gets to manipulate anything that the normal software on the machine would be doing. It could change any electronic records, change any printouts that come out of the machine. And on the machines infected with our malicious software, of course, everyone would vote for George Washington, but no matter how many people do, the machine will print results that show Benedict Arnold wins by a small but believable margin because the malicious software is manipulating the data. And moreover, it's not just one machine at a time that is potentially threatened by attacks of this style. So before every election, the ballot designs need to be prepared. In Louisiana, this happens centrally on what's called an election management system. And then memory cards are taken out to individual machines. But if an attacker can infect an election management system, they could spread malware on the removable memory cards, USB sticks, or memory cartridges, depending on the style of machine, to affect machines throughout the entire state. This is why election security in modern elections that depend on highly complex computer systems is such an important issue. This is why I think we're all here today talking about necessary improvements. And moreover, these vulnerabilities like these were not just something that affected a single machine. In the years since, researchers have performed rigorous security reviews of many, many different U.S. voting machines, from DREs to optical scanners to now BMDs as well. And in every single case where such a rigorous study has been done, one of the findings has been vulnerabilities that could allow malware to spread through the system and perform manipulation. However, and this is very, very important. Yes.
The second one at the top is what we have for Election Day.
I'm afraid it is.
Yeah.
Yes.
And then the AVC Advantage, that's our Election Day machines. And then our I don't see our early voting machines on here.
I think you have a different version, a similar version to the one in the bottom right.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I just want to make, yes, gotcha. It's not a ballot marking device. It's a DRE.
Both of those are studies that I
Gotcha.
did myself, actually. But
Gotcha.
so the point of all of this is that basically every system that you can go out and buy is going to be fallible. We're not talking about attacks necessarily that can be conducted by someone who just walks in out off the street or has just taught themselves to code. But the attackers that I worry about anyway are attackers like foreign governments, attackers like very sophisticated criminal gangs who are the ones we read about in the newspaper committing sophisticated cyber fraud and manipulation in other contexts outside of elections. We know that groups like foreign governments have targeted and attempted to penetrate election-related computer systems in the past. We have every reason to believe that they will attempt to do the same thing again in the future. Our challenge is to take this kind of vulnerable computer system and use it in a way that is still going to allow us to know that those attacks are going to be stopped, are not going to be able to change election results, and that all people can believe the results. However, there is one very important thing for the public to understand, which is that although the science has established the vulnerability of individual pieces of equipment, there's no credible evidence so far that any U.S. election result has ever been changed by hacking. There's just none. And that's after a year now of a lot of very well-meaning people digging in, and I'm glad they are, into the data from the 2020 election. It's also after 2 decades of U.S. scientists having a very keen eye on the results and performance of election systems. Now, how do we achieve security and trust using this imperfect technology? Well, first, there's the approach that Louisiana and many states take today, which is to work as hard as we can to keep attackers out of the machines. Even if it would be possible for an attacker to manipulate something with the right kind of access, we want to do things like implement security best practices and intrusion detection systems so that we can limit the potential access that adversarial parties might have and catch them if they get farther. Louisiana in particular has very experienced IT pros and great security practices. They're among the best set of practices that I've seen going from state to state across the country. I think you're doing a great job so far in protecting these systems you have. But the limitation is with a paperless system, at the end of the day, we can try really hard to keep attackers out, but we can't know for sure whether we've succeeded, because at best, there will be no evidence of any problems. But that's not quite the same thing as evidence that everything is right. Louisiana's next voting system can do better. And what a better approach looks like is to not only work as hard as we can to keep attackers out of the machines, but also provide the public with affirmative evidence that results are accurate. And this is possible to accomplish using paper ballots and risk-limiting audits. So in a paper ballot-based system, at the end of the election, you're going to end up with these mountains of paper ballots. These are original records of every voter's choices that can't later, ideally, be manipulated by any form of cyber attack. Now, the question is, how do you use paper as a defense, as a way of producing that affirmative public evidence? Now, we've heard some suggestions today about we should have just people go in and count every single one of these ballots locally. And maybe in some sense that's the abstract ideal that you want to try to approach. But in practice, it's very, very hard to do, and for two reasons. One, U.S.-style ballots are so complicated compared to other countries that do routinely count ballots by hand. Yeah, if you go to many European countries, they just have people come in and count the ballots after Election Day at the local level, but they usually only have one or two races on the ballot. Here in the U.S., when we're typically seeing 20, 30 races, so many federal, state, local contests, often other questions too, the time it takes to count every one of those races manually is just magnified by that size of the ballot. So what that means, just do the back of the envelope calculation. If you have a polling place with 5,000 voters and 20 or 30 races, well, if you have just one team of people counting the ballots, that's going to be at least a week of 12-hour days. And you can make it faster if you have 4 or 5 teams. Maybe you can complete it in a day, but then you have to have 5 separate teams of people counting ballots at every polling place and have to figure out how to staff that and secure that and everything else. The second issue is security, and here we are sitting in this, I think I've heard it called a monument to Huey Long, the state capitol here, and that I think should serve as a reminder that one of the reasons that the U.S. introduced polling place technology in the first place with the first lever machines for counting votes was because of good old-fashioned fraud involving pieces of paper. Modern computer scanner technology, combining a paper record and a digital record, is stronger against old-fashioned fraud because the digital record protects against it, and stronger against newfangled digital fraud because the paper ballots protect against it. That combination of 2 different redundant records gives us the highest possible security we can get, as long as we somehow check them to make sure they agree. But you have to do that step. You have to examine the paper to check that they agree in order to get some value out of having a paper trail. In all but the most extraordinary situations where you know something is wrong or a candidate has demanded a recount, you still need some way of referencing the paper to know that the electronic records are right. Again, trust but verify. And that's where risk-limiting audits come in. So a risk-limiting audit is a public process conducted by the election staff in which you go back, you have people go back by hand and pull out and publicly reveal enough of the ballots to ensure that if the reported outcome from the computers is wrong, there's a really high probability that you'll detect and correct this. So this is a form of really strong public and affirmative evidence that the election outcome is right. Like voters, in my view, voters have a right to be skeptical of election results, just like any other government process. But it's possible, using technology like this, to give skeptical voters still a basis for confidence in the results that you've reported. The great thing about risk-limiting audits is that they can be vastly more efficient than going for every race, for every contest, counting everything by hand. And the reason is if the election result is a landslide, well, you can prove it's a landslide just by looking at a very small number of randomly selected ballots. Or if the election result's really close, of course, then you may have to go back and look at everything, just like you would in many states that have automatic recount provisions and so forth today. Risk limiting audits have been recommended by the national academies for all states to adopt by 2028 for all federal and statewide contests. And many states have made progress towards that goal so far. I think most famously, Georgia in 2020 with their statewide hand count. That hand count happened under a provision of the state's rules directing them to do a risk limiting audit. All right, so with paper and sufficient audits.
I'm sorry, Doctor. So Georgia, going back to Georgia, did they actually physically do a hand recount, or did they rescan the ballots a second time?
They did one and then the other.
Oh, okay.
So they started with an actual hand count of every ballot, and then they did a rescan.
Okay.
And although there were some methodological and procedural limitations that I think other states could look to improve on the model, it's still a landmark event to have the first statewide risk limiting audit of such a close contest conducted, and in a situation where so many people, I think, had questions and wanted to see more evidence of the outcome.
Thank you.
So paper and audits can provide this mechanism for assuring security and trust. But there are different kinds of paper ballot voting systems, and I want to talk about some of the advantages and some of the challenges, especially security challenges, that are raised by different approaches. So I'll start with hand-marked paper ballots. Hand-marked paper ballots are, in fact, the main method of voting in 38 states, and they're used practically everywhere for absentee voting. So it's a very familiar technology. It's probably the simplest and the most fail-safe technology you can get as well. If you don't have any power across large regions because there's been a hurricane or something like that, you can still let people fill out paper ballots, collect them, and ultimately count them later by whatever means, even by hand if you must. Also, the same technology in a paper ballot system is used as the primary in-person method, early voting method, and absentee method, which helps ensure a more uniform system. Most importantly, from my opinion, paper ballots can be highly secure when paired with risk-limiting audits because, well, it's not possible for any kind of hacking to change the voters' marks after they're recorded on a piece of paper, as long as you go back and check. Modern precinct scanners additionally have the benefit that they make a complete digital record of the voter's ballot with the voter present, a scan contemporaneous with the voter placing that ballot into the ballot box. That way, if there's any kind of old-fashioned cheating or if people just suspect it, well, you can present the contemporaneous digital scans and compare them to what's on the pieces of paper and find out if anything changed. That way you can catch both old-fashioned and high-tech fraud. Paper ballots, when marked by hand, raise some challenges too. Of course, you have to print them in advance for most elections, and maintaining an adequate stock of all ballot styles in the precinct can be a challenge, especially for early voting, if you have many people who are going to the same place from different precincts to vote early. There is on-demand printing technology that's widely used to help with this, however. Paper ballots also require you to implement secure procedures for ballot transport, for chain of custody, for storage. There are administrative details that matter a lot and that require careful procedural attention. A second challenge raised by hand-marked ballots is that, well, voters sometimes make errors or leave ambiguous marks when they're filling out pieces of paper. Fortunately, modern precinct scanners can be set up to detect common mistakes like overvotes and undervotes and give voters an opportunity to correct them. Modern scanners can also flag ballots with marginal marks for manual review, either through a physical or an electronic adjudication system in which a bipartisan team usually is tasked with determining the voter's intent. In any case, risk-limiting audits can ensure that any miscounted marks or miscounted ballots due to ambiguous marks don't affect the election outcome by making sure that they are subject to public and transparent review. Finally, a major challenge in hand-marked ballots is accessibility. And people with various kinds of accessibility needs are just unable to fill out a hand-marked paper ballot independently. And we need to provide a different kind of technology to assist them. Now that brings us to ballot marking devices. And I'll first talk about ballot marking devices as they're commonly used for accessibility. Since not all voters can mark ballots by hand, and HAVA in fact requires assistive technology, what most states do is they provide at least one ballot marking device in every precinct as an assistive technology. Now, BMDs are great. As computer systems, they can provide a really flexible experience and a different experience for different voters depending on their needs. Either a basic touchscreen interface or a large type or high contrast version of the ballot for people with limited vision, an audio ballot for the blind, or even alternative input devices like a paddle system shown here or a sip and puff device. So a very wide range of voters can be accommodated. Furthermore, the marks that they make are unambiguous. Overvotes are just not allowed by the software at all, and one BMD can handle a wide variety of different ballot styles automatically.
You mentioned overvoting, and I think that's an important part to address, because if you don't have some sort of device that tells the voter that they overvoted or undervoted, then they have effectively been disenfranchised, correct?
Yes, in the contest where they've made a mistake filling out the ballot, they have been disenfranchised.
So if ballots are hand counted at the precinct level without any device that the voter can use to check their ballot in case they haven't noticed it, because we've had, I think on average, I think we're like 4 pages per election for paper ballots. So if a voter, once that vote is cast and it's being counted at the precinct level, then that individual has lost their vote one way or the other if they filled it out incorrectly.
Yes, I'm afraid so. And that is, as you indicate, an advantage of having precinct count scanners, that those scanners can flag that error for the voter and give them a chance to go back and correct them. It remains a limitation for most people who are voting by mail, of course, because they don't have that opportunity to be warned or told of the error.
But we do have a cure process in Louisiana if they are timely enough with their absentee ballot, and there is a problem, at least on the outside. On the inside we can't, but if there's a problem with them filling out the information on the flap, then the voter has a chance to cure that, so at least they have the opportunity that they possibly can, the best opportunity that they possibly can, to make sure it counts if they have not overvoted or undervoted. Okay.
Yes, and also voters who are voting absentee do have more time and less pressure, perhaps, to complete their ballots quickly and more of an opportunity to examine it for errors. There's things you can do through greater voter education to reduce the rate of mismarked ballots.
Okay, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but I thought that was an important point to make.
Do you know of any systems that will notify you, a BMD, that'll notify you you've skipped a race? you've missed 2 races or 5 races.
So BMDs can also notify you at the end with a review screen and highlight things where you have not made a mark.
Okay, that's good to know.
Yes.
There's a lot with 33 races on a ballot in front and back. That's a common thing.
Yes. But and as can scanners in the polling place when scanning someone's hand-marked ballot. Okay, so ballot marking devices, when used for accessibility, still do raise a number of challenges. In particular, there are problems that voters with disabilities face when they are the only or the primary population that are using these machines. One frequently observed issue has to do with reliability, that in some states there are often complaints that BMDs are improperly set up or malfunctioning, or that poll workers just don't know how to use them. The machine's just off in the corner or something like that when the voter arrives. To prevent this, it's really important to assure that there's adequate training and testing that treats BMDs as an essential part of the election system, and that the culture of running elections recognizes the failure of the BMD and the potential disenfranchisement of voters with disabilities as a serious and first-class problem that needs to be avoided like any other. Another issue is privacy, that is the secrecy of ballot selections. When very few voters in a precinct use BMDs and the BMD ballots look even slightly different from other voters' ballots, it may be possible to identify how that one or those 2 disabled people in that precinct voted. A best practice for avoiding this that many states do is to instruct poll workers to encourage at least a minimum number of voters to use the BMD for each precinct. And that both provides an extra assurance that the BMD is working properly and makes it so you have more, so it's impossible to determine that the particular voter voted a certain way. Finally, some perceive having different voting machines, just paper ballot or a BMD experience, as a problem for equality. But I would point out that even with BMDs for all, voters with different abilities are going to have a different experience when voting. An audio ballot is just not going to be the same as a touchscreen experience. I recommend prioritizing ensuring that everyone's needs are well served by the totality of your election system, by offering a range of assistive options. And some things that are practiced in various jurisdictions include offering curbside voting for people with mobility limitations, online ballot marking to allow people to complete postal ballots at home with the assistive technology they already use, etc. And I believe that at least that latter is already in effect in Louisiana.
That is correct.
Now, there's another way to use BMDs that a few states have recently adopted, which is to use BMDs as the primary method of voting for essentially all in-person voters, as opposed to having most voters voting by hand. Universal use BMDs, however, introduce some major security challenges that I'd like to tell you about. And some of these are things that the science of election security community has only really dug into in the past 2 or 3 years. The most important thing to remember is that BMDs are not simply pens. They are potentially vulnerable computers that are sitting between the voter and the primary and permanent record of their vote. If a BMD is hacked, it could be programmed to misprint certain voters' ballots, to alter the votes that come out in the printout, etc. And some styles of errors on BMDs, voters just have no way to detect. Others, voters, we know from studies and field observations, voters can't reliably detect. And if the paper ballots are wrong, well, no amount of post-election auditing or recounting of that paper trail can help. When BMDs are used by everyone, though, as opposed to just a relatively smaller population with accessibility needs, then they become a much larger and more attractive target. And it makes them more likely to be targeted at all and increases the threat for everyone, not only the disabled or the non-disabled segment of your population. When there's no risk limiting audit or recount, in fact, the risks may be as high or higher when using BMDs for everyone as they are for DREs. Now you have two potentially vulnerable machines, the BMD and the scanner, either of which could perhaps be hacked to alter election outcomes. All right.
I'm sorry, Ms. Dejon, you have a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that in regards to the option currently in Louisiana that allows for an individual with a disability to mark their ballot with their assistive technology at home, that was implemented with Act 508 of 2016. And so essentially a voter with a disability receives an accessible PDF via email where they can mark it with their assistive technology. But unfortunately, this still leaves accessibility gaps. Currently, absentee voting is still not accessible for people with disabilities. And I think that's particularly important for this commission to know moving forward, because this still requires a person with a disability to print out their ballot and either mail it back to the registrar's office or drop it off at a polling location. And it stands to reason that if an individual cannot independently mark their ballot, they also cannot independently put it in an envelope, mail it off, or drop it off at a polling location. So I just wanted to make that quick note.
Well, thank you for that comment, Ms. Dejon. Commissioner, I agree with you completely that it's important for us to recognize where there are accessibility gaps and to continue to find ways to offer new ways to support those voters in exercising their franchise. Now, in turning to BMDs, there are different options that different BMD models have that sometimes may increase the security risks relative to others. And just two that I'd like to highlight are BMDs that use an all-in-one style and BMDs that use barcode ballots. All-in-one BMDs combine the BMD, the printer, and the scanner into a single device. And this can have the problem that in certain models, the printer is on the same paper path as the scanner. This means that if the machine is hacked, it could potentially alter the ballot even after the voter has seen it. So you take it and examine it and then put it back in. Well, it goes past the printer again. And so that sort of defeats the security purpose of having this paper in the first place. Ballots with barcodes also raise some concern. So in some systems, the BMDs print a barcode on the ballot, and what the scanners count is what's in that barcode rather than the human readable text of the ballot that the voter had an opportunity to verify. This, of course, raises the risk that a hacked BMD could change what's in the barcodes and voters would have no way to tell. Of course, this is another reason why having a risk-limiting audit in which people later manually examine the printed text of the ballots to confirm the computerized outcome is so important. But I'd point out that even if RLAs are conducted and can assure that the election outcome is right, RLAs in general aren't designed to protect every individual vote from manipulation. And so there's still some worry about disenfranchisement of individuals there. The final caveat about BMDs has to do with whether voters reliably verify the paper trail that they produce. So the goal of an audit, of course, is to assure that the total set of ballots produces the same election outcome as what voters intended. But if the ballots don't accurately reflect voters' intent, that can be undermined. Even without barcodes, hacked BMDs could potentially be programmed to sometimes print different choices than what voters select on screen. And unfortunately, you can't reliably test for this prior to the election. We found that there are just too many factors that an attacker could potentially use to trigger the cheating to cover them all. So instead, we rely with BMDs on voters to to review their ballots and spot any changes, and if the ballot doesn't reflect their intent, spoil it and vote a new one. The question is, do voters in practice reliably spot errors in such printouts? And until about 2 years ago, different people in the field had vastly different intuitions about how well voters would do if actually tasked and challenged with BMD ballots that differed from what they intended. So my research group ran a study where we brought about 250 people into a mock polling place we set up and asked them to vote on BMDs that we had actually hacked to change at random one selection on each ballot. What we found is that voters in this mock election spotted less than 7% of the errors. That's far fewer than I would have expected going into this experiment. What that means, in a contest with a margin of 0.5%, if all in-person voters were using BMDs, election officials would be told about one error by about one voter out of every 5,000, if there was enough cheating to change the outcome of that election. One vote in 5,000 is not a lot, and not a lot of opportunity to detect that something is systematically going wrong with your equipment. Moreover, my study determined that there are steps that jurisdictions can take to encourage voters to verify that will help somewhat. The problem is the amount of improvement doesn't look like it's enough to make a big difference. Several states have adopted these recommendations. Georgia, for instance, has poll workers right at the scanner remind the voter to review their ballot. But during the 2020 election, in a study commissioned by the Georgia Secretary of State, researchers at the University of Georgia watched what voters actually did and whether they reviewed their ballot, and found that less than 20% of voters spent at least 5 seconds reviewing their ballots. That's about 0.2 seconds per contest. Barely enough time to notice anything was wrong. About half of voters in that study only glanced at their ballots or didn't look at them at all. So while the ballots may be verifiable in principle, the actual practice and actual human behavior is that the great majority of those ballots are either not verified or are not well verified. Now, using BMDs specifically for accessibility while allowing most voters to vote by hand makes things safer against these threats. That's because attackers would need to change a much larger fraction of the BMD ballots in that case to affect an election outcome. And if you have to change 100% of BMD ballots to affect the outcome, well, detection is going to be much more likely than if you only have to change 1 out of every 200. So my recommendation is, with the current state of technology and current state of voter verification, that we should try to avoid universal use BMDs at the present time. I want to have give you one more thought about what this kind of limited verification performance by voters might mean in practice. This is a hypothetical scenario. So imagine a state that's using universal use BMDs. Everyone in the precinct votes on them. There's some contentious statewide contest that's decided by a few thousand votes across the state. A few hundred voters after the election complained that the BMDs initially printed the wrong choice on their ballots. What is the state supposed to do? This scenario is fully consistent with the BMDs having been hacked in a way that would have changed the election outcome, in which case the only way to correct the problem would be to rerun the election. You could, I suppose, try to do some kind of digital forensics, but that would be very, very slow, expensive, and likely inconclusive. But at the same time, it's also consistent, this scenario, with the complaints being false or mistaken or just voter error. There's no good way to resolve this and restore public confidence. And I can't imagine being in the shoes of a state official forced with having to make such a difficult choice. We can avoid this by using systems that are primarily marked by hand by those who can, and that provide state-of-the-art assistive technology for people who need it. And in fact, looking at the national view, that's the type of system that the majority of states, representing about 70% of the voting population, use today, hand-marked paper ballot systems with BMDs or other technology for accessibility. About 20% of voters live in jurisdictions that are using ballot marking devices for all, and about 8%, but hopefully going down soon, still live in jurisdictions that use DREs. The national map also, if I were to show you the version of this that covered post-election audits and deployment of RLAs, I don't have that in this deck today, but would paint, unfortunately, not quite such a positive picture. Although many states are piloting RLAs today, full implementation is still probably years away in most of the country. So that's a place where we need national progress soon. So let me wrap up with just an observation of what an amazing opportunity Louisiana has today, thanks to the work of this commission. I think that this commission is poised to make Louisiana truly a national leader in election security. Although the state is the last state in the country to use paperless DREs statewide, you have really great people, strong foundations, including very good IT security. And I think you're at a pivotal moment with the large magnitude of public concern about election integrity that we're experiencing. My recommendation would be to transition the state to a secure and primarily hand-marked voting system based on precinct count, optical scan technology, and with state-of-the-art assistive devices for those who need them. I'd also recommend continuing to safeguard the computer components of the election system with IT best practices to make any kinds of attacks as hard as they can possibly be. But then to ensure that the public doesn't have to take anyone's word for it, to ensure that if there are attacks that we just don't spot, despite the effort that's put into trying to detect them. It's important to implement best-in-class post-election audits with risk-limiting audit technology in order to provide that kind of affirmative evidence. A number of states over the past decade or so have transitioned to hand-marked paper from DRE systems. These include large parts of California, Kentucky, Maryland, New York, Pennsylvania, Utah, Virginia, and others. And I'd encourage you to draw on their experiences and what's worked well and what hasn't in terms of educating voters and anticipating problems. But this is your chance, really, this commission, to create elections that work for everyone and that everybody can have confidence in. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. Wow, that's a lot. Senator Hewitt for a question.
A lot for before lunch after this long day.
It's going to be before dinner for some of us.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, thank you for that great presentation. Really appreciated all that information. Tell me again, and maybe I missed this, the best time in the process for a risk-limiting audit.
Yes, thank you, Senator. So what the National Academies recommends is that risk-limiting audits be conducted pre-certification. So after voting has happened and before the election results is finally certified, that way if there is any kind of problem that's revealed by the audit, either error or potentially fraud, it can be corrected.
So it's after the results are announced, let's say on election night, but in that 5 days or 10 days or whatever it is before we certify the results.
Many jurisdictions are challenged in this way because they do have such short timelines between voting and certification, which are already in almost every case really, really packed. So one thing that I'd encourage the Commission to consider is if there is a need for added flexibility in that timeline, to perhaps think about whether the election calendar can be adjusted in ways to permit auditing to happen prior to certification.
Well, I know people that can do that, so can modify the election laws.
We can't say amen enough to that.
Yeah.
I mean, we really do need more time.
But I will point out that some of the pilot risk limiting audits that states have been conducting, just because they're new, and B, because of the pressure in the election calendar. For the election in 2020 in November, these audits took place in late December or in January, or some of these pilots even later than that. Still an opportunity to boost public confidence, assuming that the audit does really confirm the election result, but not ideal.
Sure. Okay. Well, thank you very much. I agree with you. I do think that this is a great opportunity for the state of Louisiana. You know, we are the state that has an opportunity. We were already working on changing our elections, our voting system. Now we have lots of interest and best practices to build on, as well as, you know, the things that we already do in our state that we do very well. And so I do think it's a great opportunity for us. I'm very confident that this commission is going to work hard to do just that. So thank you for your presentation and for your work today.
And thank you. And I would point out that you also have a significant advantage in having a centralized election system where it's possible to implement practices that are going to be applied across the state. We don't have that in Michigan, and it's a recurring challenge for us to try to make sure that good practices get out to all of the local jurisdictions.
Well, I think that's another great point. And I don't know how many states are centralized like we are, but it does allow you to make changes at the state level and not leave it to 64 different parishes to change their equipment or their processes. So I think that's a great advantage as well. Thank you again. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you, Senator. Mr. Lunsford.
I was curious, you talked about doing scanning of the hand-marked paper ballots on Election Day. Is that after the 8 p.m. closing of the polls, or is that throughout the day? I think you'd mentioned doing it throughout the day to kind of verify that they hadn't forgotten anything. But as Ms. Smith had mentioned, what's the possibility for nefarious deeds to happen in that window?
Commissioner Lunsford, the scanning that I was talking about, that I was addressing, was what's happening in the precinct as voters are casting their ballots. And precinct count optical scan systems, there's basically a scanner mounted on top of the ballot box, and you, the voter, are feeding your ballot directly into that scanner yourself. No one else is looking at it or touching it, and the scanner is able to give you some feedback if anything is mismarked. For mail-in ballots, that's a different style of counting, and different states have different requirements about when that can take place, when you can start scanning mail-in ballots. In some states, officials are not allowed to start scanning those until after the close of polls on Election Day, which is one of the reasons why we saw some late-breaking changes to results happening in 2020. But again, I'm sure every election official you talk to is going to ask you for more time to get that process done, ideally to be able to get as much of it done before the close of polls as possible so that people don't have to wait a long time to understand the results.
Well, the question was, is there a risk involved with a computer scanning ballots earlier than the closing of the polls?
I see. So you necessarily, in essentially every computer-based scanning system in the country that is precinct count, it's happening all day long, or it's happening also during early voting. And one of the things that we want to avoid, of course, is letting anyone find out early what the results look like, because that could have political implications. But modern systems are designed by and large so that in normal, non-malicious operation, they don't let you find out what the results are before the polls are closed. Now, every computer system is going to have potential vulnerabilities, and there are going to be some steps that we have to take to combat them. But again, the risk limiting audit component lets you go back and make sure that every one of those scanned ballots taken together is going to give you the same outcome as what the computer results are, regardless of whether something was manipulated before elections were closed or whether there was some kind of manipulation afterwards. Does that answer your question, sir?
Well, I was kind of worried about the computer systems leaking information on election day as things are coming in, and so I don't know that it answers the question directly. But thank you.
They're designed to make that more difficult. It's definitely not impossible for information to be leaked out if there's someone who's able to access that system who is unauthorized or malicious, but we try to make that hard through things like if it's operating in a polling place, having people watch it, and through things like making sure that machines are up to date.
Appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Senator Hewitt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to, a little personal point of personal privilege here. I am going to have to get on the road to go to Lake Charles for some redistricting commitments, but I wanted the members of the public to know I see a big stack of cards and lots of you are anxious to speak, and so I will be monitoring it on my phone on the way to Lake Charles. I've got several hours of windshield time, so y'all talk away and I'll be listening.
Thank you very much.
Thank y'all. I appreciate everybody being here today.
So, Professor Halderman, you said you're on the Commission for Election Integrity or Security?
Michigan's Election Security Advisory Commission for the Secretary of State.
Okay. So did you all look at the issues in Antrim County at all during... Were y'all created after for that reason, or could you expound on what happened?
Of course.
I get a lot of questions about that.
Yes. So the Election Security Advisory Commission was actually created I believe, in 2019, in the beginning of the year, to advise the state on increased protections ahead of the 2020 election. And the state has already implemented several of its recommendations, including its pilot risk limiting audit came out of the recommendations of the commission. But after 2020, not the commission, but I individually was tasked by the Michigan Secretary of State and the State Attorney General with doing a post-election investigation of what happened in Antrim County. And what happened in Antrim, for people who maybe haven't heard of the story, is Antrim County, Michigan reported badly incorrect unofficial election night results. The initial results were off by magnitudes of several thousand votes in some cases in virtually every race on the ballot. And this included a county that had historically been very much a red county, having a landslide victory for Joe Biden and just a handful of votes relatively for Donald Trump. Just a totally implausible result. Now, the state and the county realized early the morning after the election that something was not right with these results, and they pulled the results down and explained very quickly that it had been the result of some kind of human error. They went back and they manually entered the results from each individual machine's poll tape. And this is the printout of the totals for each candidate that each individual scanner produces. And from that, they published new corrected results, I believe the day after the election, that were vastly more plausible and looked like what you would have expected. But there are lingering questions about, well, exactly what happened? Were the errors corrected entirely? Will this happen again, et cetera? And those were some of the questions that the Secretary of State and Attorney General asked me to investigate. So what I did was I went through all of the digital evidence of the election, the election management system computer server, the copies of the memory cards from every one of the machines. I looked at the poll tapes, et cetera, all of this data. And I was able to reconstruct very precisely what happened. And it turned out that the state was correct, that this was an unusual kind of human error, compounded by other human errors, compounded by procedures that should have prevented the errors from happening that didn't, compounded by an election technology that probably should have done more to help election officials catch their own mistakes. Essentially, what happened is they updated they had to make a last-minute change to some of the ballot designs because a race or a candidate had been omitted in one or another local precinct, local ballot. The effect of making that change, well, after making that change, they had to reprogram, or should have reprogrammed, all of their machines with the new election definition. But instead of that, they only updated the machines in particular parts of the county. When they went to load in the results from precincts where the ballot designs had not been updated, because they were using incompatible versions of this ballot definition file, the results for candidates didn't line up with the right people when those numbers were loaded into the central system. And that caused votes for Biden, for instance, to be just totally discarded, votes for Donald Trump to be assigned to Biden, votes for the Libertarian candidate to be assigned to Trump, and so forth down the ballot in those affected precincts. But by going through all of the digital data, I was able to the vote, reconstruct the error based on this asserted change to the ballot design being the cause. And you find exactly the same error as what was reported on election night if you account for the different complexities of this shift. So furthermore, if you don't want to believe the digital evidence, the state also went in and recounted by hand the presidential race on every ballot in Antrim County and got a result that agreed with the announced corrected results to within, I believe, 0.1%. Which is about the margin of error that you expect for a hand count.
So, okay. So they basically failed to follow their own set procedures that would have caught this error before the election itself.
So they missed a step in failing to reprogram all of the voting machines. That was unfortunate, but you can sort of understand how someone in a hurry might misunderstand how this complex technology works and missed that step. Then, unfortunately, they also missed an opportunity to more rigorously test the machines again after that change, before the votes were counted. Also, and probably most significantly to preventing the election night error, the poor county election official, having worked for 6 hours to load memory cards into the system at about 4 a.m., published the results without proofreading them very well, and so didn't catch right away that something was wrong. And that, unfortunately, has had a terrible effect on voters' confidence in the system, not just in Antrim, but nationwide. This was something that should have been stopped beforehand. But then even afterwards, unfortunately, and as I think we've seen that the state in Ms. Smith's presentation, the data that Michigan, where Antrim County had to correct its results multiple times, well, in the first time they corrected it, entering the poll tapes by hand, they accidentally left some of the old data in the system too. And so there were large parts of the county where you had the sum of the incorrect results plus the correct results. They took those out and reported it again, but there were still typos in some of the manually entered results from the poll tapes that should have been caught during the county, what's called the county canvass, where they go back and compare the announced results to what's on the poll tapes, but from individual machines. But the canvassers evidently were not diligent enough to catch all of those errors. So this resulted in Antrim having to report its results about 5 times and make numerous corrections. But on the state of Michigan's website, if you Google for my name in Antrim County, you can find the report that I produced that's, I think, a 54-page technical but still accessible, very, very detailed summation of what happened in Antrim County, and hopefully in enough detail to answer anyone's lingering doubts if you have the time or the interest to go and take a look.
Are there any other states that, and you talked about, and I know you can't get into details about some of it, but have there been other states or counties, jurisdictions that you've worked for that you've found vulnerabilities in their systems, whether it's electronic system or a paper-based system that may use some electronic components? Have you found other vulnerabilities out there that you've brought to the attention of the jurisdictions and solved their problem?
Yes, numerous times. In addition to the early work with that Diebold machine I showed you here, I also participated in the state of California's what's called the top-to-bottom voting systems review. So the California Secretary of State, and I believe this was in about 2007, required the voting system vendors to turn over the source code to their machines to the Secretary of State and allow them to bring in their own team of experts to comb over the code to every piece of election equipment in the state and assess its security and find problems. And the state brought in nationally leading authorities on security and election security to conduct that, and we found dozens and dozens of problems in essentially every piece of equipment. Many of those, fortunately, were of the type that a software change could correct the problem. Others were more difficult to correct. And unfortunately, at the end of the day, there's no guarantee that an analysis like that will find every problem there. But you hope to find enough to make it to raise the cost for another attacker trying to do the same thing. Since then, I've looked at technology in other states and countries. Most recently, the ballot marking devices used statewide in Georgia, which I've conducted a very detailed security analysis as an expert in a civil rights lawsuit that's been going on for several years in Georgia. That, unfortunately, as I believe Colonel Waldron mentioned, the results of that investigation are under seal with the court. I wish I could share more with you publicly today, but they have now been shared with Dominion. So at least in some cases, Dominion will be able to, I hope, implement some changes that will make some of those problems more difficult to exploit. But I don't have confidence that, as the National Academy says, we simply cannot, with existing technology, be assured that all vulnerabilities are eliminated from a particular piece of election equipment, even with this kind of analysis and review. And for that reason, while finding the vulnerabilities and patching them is critically important, it's also important at the end of the day to trust but verify that system. So even if it is subject to compromise, everyone can be assured that we get the right election result.
Thank you. Mr. Clary.
I'm going to tread carefully with these questions because I know your report in Georgia is under seal. And so if you can't answer these questions, just say I can't answer it. But the machines, they were ballot marking devices there?
That's correct, Commissioner.
And those were manufactured by Dominion? Was that the only manufacturer?
That's correct. They used Dominion ballot marking devices statewide in Georgia.
Do we have any idea when that report will become publicly available?
That is the jurisdiction of the court, so the federal court in Georgia.
Okay. Thank you.
I will point out that the judge in that case has said that she would be receptive to requests from other states to receive a copy of the report for mitigating problems in their own systems if they're able to assure the court that its confidentiality will be maintained.
So just for the commission and for the public, I have my attorneys working with a firm that I have already a contract with, who also has partners in Georgia, and we have been working on and are close to it, but we're finalizing. As an attorney, you understand, we're finalizing what's the best way for us to get into limited way to find out what that means for us and what we need to do, given the concerns with that. So we also, I sent a letter, I think now it's probably been a month, as soon as we heard that CISA was on top of it. I think it was a news article, and we did call Dr. Halderman and couldn't really even talk. But we focused in on asking CISA as soon as, if the court is inclined, and as soon as they make that information available to CISA, we would like to get our IT folks with them immediately for mitigation purposes. So.
Thank you. And this kind of information sharing is just so important between states and between states and their vendors about finding out what's known about the security of the equipment and trying to get it fixed. So,
Absolutely. Mr. Rayburn.
Dr. Halderman, thank you for your very informative presentation. My question is about your comments on the hybrid systems with ballot marking device and hand marked paper ballot. So it seems like there's disadvantages of all ballots being marked by the ballot marking device, and there's disadvantages of too few being marked by the ballot marking device. Are there any best practices that you recommend in achieving some balance there?
yes, Commissioner. As I said, there's a practice that some states apply wherein poll workers try to encourage at least a minimum number of people in each jurisdiction to use the ballot marking device to assure that it's working and to provide a larger, what we'd call a cover set or an anonymity set for the secret ballot, so that you can't tell the only ballot is this individual disabled voters if there's such a small population. In terms of how many people you want to be using the BMD in a given jurisdiction, I'd have to give that a little bit more thought. I believe in Maryland, their practice is to target, I don't remember, between 1% and 2%, something like that. But it probably depends a lot on how many different ballot styles are there within a jurisdiction, within a polling place, and how many disabled voters you expect to use the BMD without having to go to further encouragement to get others to use it as well.
Thank you.
The board is clear.